This story took place months ago. I had a friend. Let me just call his name as Cheese while I'm telling the story. So whenever Cheese and I got bored in those days, we usually went to the forest to discover new routes and places near our houses. Sometimes we reached a gated property and we entered the property through the forest. It was so much fun to see that the security guard didn't know that we were coming in and going out. However, this incident changed everything, and we never went to another place since that day. One day it was kind of late on that day and we were riding our bike as usual. The sky got darker and darker and we passed through the forest, bushes, and unpaved roads. The forest was so thick that we could hardly see any source of light. Thanks to my mom, she had told me to take my phone with me, and I could move forward, turning on the flashlight. Then, all of a sudden, we heard a rustling noise in the bushes. We stopped and both turned our eyes to it. Cheese stared at me with shivering eyes and said, "Hey, why don't we just go back?" I don't know what gave me the courage to say, "But we're almost halfway, I guess. Let's go forward." So we began to move again, riding our bike. But Cheese suddenly stopped and I could see the frightened look on his face. I also stopped at the spot and looked where his eyes were headed. Something was in front of us. My mouth was wide open when I saw an old man standing alone and muttering something. We couldn't hear anything, but we could read his lip movements in the bright light of the fire he set around. Then Cheese pointed his finger at something. I noticed that something was wrong. There were someone's skulls forming a circle around him. You can't imagine how I got terrified at that time. It was impossible for us to run away because the old man was blocking our way. He slowly turned his body toward us and said something like this:
"We need some more sacrifice."
Then he pulled out his pocket knife and ran toward us. I knew I had to think fast. Screaming, I took my helmet off and threw it at his face, and Cheese grabbed a big stone on the road and threw it at him at the same time. He dodged my helmet, but fortunately the stone got him accurately. He hit his head hard by the stone and fell down on the road. And we turned our cycles back and drove off as fast as we could without looking back. The next day we checked that same place, but neither the man nor the circle of skulls remained. We've kept this story secret, but to this day I always think of the same thing. What would have happened to me if Cheese hadn't have thrown that stone at the old man? Who was he, and what was he doing? I have no idea.
My family is a small farm here in Kirkwood, upstate New York. We grow a few veggies, keep a few chickens, nothing too spectacular, but it's home and we love it. But a little while ago, back in early 2019, we got woken up by something in the middle of the night that scared the absolute life out of us. We have this big front yard with flower beds and a big lawn, and that's where we keep the chickens and the dog too. So me, my mom, and my dad were all sleeping one night when we were woken up by this huge crash in the front yard. I can hear our dog barking really, really loud and violently before there's like this yelping sound from it and he goes quiet. I walk out into the hallway and see my dad storming out of my parents' bedroom, rushing down the stairs to get his shotgun. Me and my mom were about to follow him outside to get a look at whatever was going on, but he yells at us to call the cops, stay inside, and not follow him under any circumstances. My dad grabs the phone and I rush back into my bedroom to watch from the window. As soon as I look out, I see this car that's smashed through the fence of our yard and torn up a section of our lawn. It's obviously really dark out, and the car's headlights are only lighting up a section of our yard, so I can't really see much outside of the beams. But I do see something that absolutely breaks my heart. It's our dog, lying on the front lawn, not moving at all. He looked really hurt. Something had really messed him up. But given that he was barking after the actual smash of the car, it couldn't have been the impact that hurt him so bad. Something else entirely. What I saw next was only because my dad had this little light attached to the end of his shotgun. He starts shining it around the front yard as I hear my mom calling 911 in the hallway, telling them that something horrible had happened at our address and for them to come as quickly as they could. Then my dad shines the shotgun light over towards the chicken coop, and I saw something that I continue to see in my nightmares for a long time to come. It was a man, completely naked from head to toe, kneeling among torn-out feathers and broken bodies, and he was sinking his teeth into the flesh of a still-living chicken that he held tight in his grip. Every time he bit into the chicken, it would flap and shake, making the most awful screeching noises as he tore more raw flesh from its body. My dad racked a shell into the chamber and started screaming at the guy to get out of the chicken coop. But the guy barely listens at first, just carries on ripping this big brown chicken apart with his bare hands and teeth. And by the time he does actually start listening to my dad, God, it was horrible. He looked right into the light of the shotgun so that his face was perfectly lit up, and he smiled. There was blood and feathers all over his face and chin. He looked monstrous, totally insane, eyes bulging out of their sockets. I think even to this day it's probably the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I started banging on the window and begging my dad to come back inside. I was so scared the guy was going to attack him or something, and if he did, that Dad would shoot him. And I know it's maybe a little lame of me, but I just didn't want to see any of that. I was already distraught from seeing our dog just lying there all lifeless on the lawn, and I know I wouldn't be able to handle it if anything had happened to my dad. Luckily, the guy didn't bother doing anything to my dad at first. I think he was just so blinded by the light of the shotgun that he just sort of stared into the flashlight, hypnotized by it for a few seconds. But he soon rose up off of his knees, that bloody, twitching chicken still in his grip, and started to make a move towards my dad. As soon as he did, the sound of Dad's shotgun rang out as he fired a shot above the guy's head. But the guy hardly flinched. That's when I realized he must have been on some kind of drug or something, maybe meth or PCP or whatever. He didn't seem scared at all by the fact that he'd almost had his head blown off, but it was definitely enough to put him off from straight up attacking my dad. He just carried on smiling though, kneeling back down among the chickens as he carried on ripping them apart. It felt like an hour before I finally saw the red and blue flashing lights of the cop cars coming down the road. But from what I learned later, it was only a couple of minutes before they actually arrived, since they happened to have a unit in the area already down highway patrol. When they arrested the guy, he got really crazy, and they had to actually use their tasers, which had little effect at first, and pepper spray on the guy just to get him on the ground. We later found out that the guy, named John Many, was actually from Florida, that there had been a manhunt for him, and he'd somehow gotten all the way up to New York State using stolen cars and hiding himself away in trucks. We weren't the only place he'd attacked either, since he actually killed another dog on a different farm, maybe less than 2 miles away from us. That was definitely the most terrifying thing I'd ever woken up to in the middle of the night, by a long shot too. Thankfully, our dog survived.
About 10 years ago, my family had a studio rental business in a big city. Our studio had the most thorough security system at that time. So as a result, our studio became the best place for those parents who ever wanted to send their daughter from the rural area to the city. Even though the rent price was highly expensive, our studio was always traded, and because of that, the gender ratio of women was far higher. At that time, there was a woman who had moved into our studio for about 3 months. She was the kind of annoying type that she requested changing the automatic door lock's password several times a month. There was a manual in the room that helps you to change the password for oneself, but she kept asking us to do it every time, saying that it was complicated. We felt like she was the type who was going to fuss about our studio someday, so we always did her favor whenever she asked. But one day, she started saying something strange. She said that someone seemed to be coming inside of her room when she wasn't there. Of course, we have a master card to enter every room, but I swear, we are not those ignorant types of owners who come in and go out of any room, except for sometimes when people who leave their rooms without telling us they had changed the password, or when we had to do an electrical inspection for the empty rooms, asking for prior consent already. But she seemed to doubt me, because I was the one who guarded the studio during my university vacation. Anyway, my parents sent her back to her room kindly, saying that she might be mistaken at first. Then the other day, she came up angrily this time. She said that she put a piece of paper in the crack of the door and folded the edge of the bed's blanket slightly when she went out. However, when she came back again, then she found that the paper was fallen on the ground and the blanket was all spread out. Cursing me tremendously, she had already believed 100% that I was certainly the criminal. At the time, I was ordering food and in a good mood after cleaning the roof in a heavy sweat, and this woman's behavior slowly pissed me off. And even my parents seemed to be suspicious of me at this point. But I couldn't confirm what was happening on each floor because there was only one CCTV in the front door and another one in the parking lot at that time. No matter how I felt the unfairness, I couldn't just install all the CCTV using a huge sum of money to capture the evidence of the woman who has such a megalomania and mythomania. So I put a digital camera that had very low resolution at that time in a beverage box and put it in a hallway where she was living. I had to go down every 2 hours and empty the memory, and I finally ended up thinking that I wouldn't be able to do this anymore after about 3 days. On the 4th day, the incident happened. That day, the police knocked on our door first. Following them, when I looked inside the woman's room, I could see the pearl-like eyeshadow was spread on every side of the walls. It turned out that the woman had coated the doorknob with cosmetics when she went down to her hometown for a few days, hoping the criminal to leave a trace when he broke into her room. But as if he were mocking her, the criminal had put those pearl shadows all over the walls, ceilings, and even floors of the room. So the police came to my room after receiving the woman's report. They started to investigate whether they could find any traces of pearl shadow on my keyboard, mouse, drawer handle, faucet, and even the toilet watering lever. But it was nonsense. I was just eating delivery food without knowing anything. The wash basin in the woman's room, which had been empty for 4 days, was completely wet, as if someone had just finished taking a shower, and I could see the soap was expanded. I was eventually called to the police station as a witness for questioning. When I finally got back home, I brought my camera that I had installed before to see what was on it, just in case. And then, something strange was caught in the camera. On the second night, around 11 p.m., the woman's boyfriend was filmed entering that empty room. He wasn't in the video for the 3rd day, and of course I couldn't film it for the 4th day. It was a suspicious thing. In the end, I went to the police station again with my camera and submitted it. The whole story of the incident that was revealed later was like this. It was her boyfriend who made her terrorized and tremble in an attempt to bring her into his studio. While she went to college, he kept sneaking into her room and left those suspicious traces for a month. Then, as his girlfriend noticed the strangeness, she told him what had happened, and he kept telling her about the cruel and scary murdering cases that occurred in a studio apartment. Later, he suggested to her that she could sleep in his house if she was scared. His final goal was cohabitating with the woman, and the climax happened on that day. After hearing that she had set up a trap at the door, he entered her room and rubbed the pearl shadows on the whole room more than she did. Of course, the sink, the blanket, and the paper between the doors, everything was all by him. He thought that if his girlfriend felt extreme fear, she would end up living with him. What was even more creepy was that when the police came to our studio that day, he was comforting his girlfriend calmly, hugging her in his arms. The more she got afraid, the more courteously that bastard consoled her, and kept thinking about how he could make her scared on the other hand. In the end, the man was accused by the woman and her family, and the woman took time off from school due to the huge shock. There's something I want to confess about, so I'm going to write it down on this anonymous site. I'd like to talk about one thing I really did wrong. When I was in elementary school, I had to ride my bike to school because there was some distance from my house to my school. My house was located in a back alley. One day on my way home, I was riding my bike around the curve, and I couldn't slow down, so I ran over an old lady. She collapsed, passing out, and I rushed back to my house, being terrified. She was a very kind person in my town. She was close to my family and people in the neighborhood, so she always greeted me kindly whenever she saw me. Back then, the CCTVs weren't installed around on the streets, so no matter what happened in the alley, there was no way to find out who did it. And the next day, a handwritten poster was attached to the alley wall. "We're finding a witness. My grandmother had an accident. We don't want to believe it, but if the criminal is one of our neighbors, please confess. We don't want strong punishment either. We just want to resolve the injustice." It was written something like this. She returned home shortly after being treated for a concussion, and after that, her health began to deteriorate rapidly, because she was quite an old lady. I was afraid that I'd be revealed that I did it, but she didn't seem to remember the incident, or was she just pretending that she couldn't remember? Anyway, she was always spending time in the same place, enjoying the wind or the sun, and I had to avoid that place where she was. I shouldn't say it like this, but fortunately, I wasn't caught. As time went by, my guilt gradually became dull, and I was living without much thought of it. When I was in high school, she had dementia. And one other day, I was passing by the alley and I met the old lady again. I greeted her unconsciously. I'm not sure if she had a clear mind or not, but anyway, she smiled at me and said like this, "Oh, hello. So you don't ride your bike anymore?" The cold sweat soaked my back in a brief moment. Without answering, I just ran away, and time passed. The old lady passed away after I became an adult, and there's still the guilt in the corner of my heart. Since I can't tell this story to anyone, I hope you guys understand me using the power of anonymity to write it here. I know, I'm just the most terrible trash in the world.
When I was in elementary school, I had a friend who lived right next door. We used to go to school together all the time. One day, I was standing in front of my friend's house waiting for her as usual, and I realized that she was kind of strange when she came out. She looked kind of bemused. When I looked more closely, she was breaking out in a cold sweat. Feeling something strange, I asked my friend what was going on, and she started telling me a story about her dream. She started to dream the same dream she had from long ago. A kind-looking old lady always comes out in her dreams, and she cooks meals for her and then she eats it all. My friend had a lot of conversations with her because she gave her such a good impression. The most amazing thing was when she woke up. She felt full, as if she had actually eaten, even though it was just a dream. My friend lived alone with her maternal grandmother at the time, but on another day when my friend was about to go to school, she repeatedly requested one thing from her with a scary face. "Do not follow the stranger or anyone today, okay? Do not." My friend was confused for a moment, but reassured her grandmother, telling her not to worry, and then went to school. However, nothing happened all day. And that night, she fell asleep, and the old lady appeared in her dream as usual, and made her a meal. She was enjoying her meal, and all of a sudden, the old lady asked my friend to go somewhere with her. She held the old lady's hand and tried to follow her thoughtlessly. However, she then remembered what her grandmother said to her in the morning, so she let go of her hand and refused to go. Then she saw her face turn scary at that moment. The old lady suddenly grabbed the back of my friend's neck and began to drag her somewhere, and no matter how hard she tried to escape, she wouldn't budge at all. While she was trembling with fear, she then remembered the other thing that her grandmother had told her in the morning. "If you're dragged by someone in your dreams, don't panic. Just slam your head against somewhere, like a wall or a pillar. Then you will wake up from your dream. Understand?" My friend, who remembered the advice, saw a tree in front of her and tried to hit her head, but suddenly The old lady laughed as she pulled my friend's head. "Who taught you this?" "Oh, I see. Your grandmother did." So she failed to wake up and was being dragged away from her dream. And the old lady's cane suddenly caught her eye. At that moment, she bumped her head with all her strength on the stick, and then finally woke up from her dream. I got goosebumps listening to my friend, since it was early in the morning. Anyway, my friend, who had been absent-minded all day, started skipping school the following day. I was worried about her, so I went to her house. But the door didn't open, and she didn't answer the phone. A month later, my friend called me, and she asked me to come over to her house. With curiosity, I ran to her house, and when I saw her again, she looked emaciated, and the atmosphere around her was quite different. Most of all, she kept laughing to herself like crazy. She dragged me into the house, took me to a room, and said this: "Hey, you see my granny? She's crazy." Then she began to giggle more, and I unconsciously turned my eyes to the room. Her grandmother, looking into the air continuously, was begging desperately in a small, tiny room without a beam of light. Her face seemed afraid of something, and she kept muttering the same words. "I didn't teach her. That was not me. Please, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Later, I heard that her grandmother had passed away shortly after, and my friend has been hospitalized because of the shock. Come to think of it now, wasn't the food she always ate in her dreams a meal for her grandmother, who would die soon?
I am an immigrant from Belarus. English is not my first language, so I apologize if I phrase things differently. Here's some backstory. I was only 11 when my family left the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My father was involved with the Communist Party and would frequently visit Moscow when I was a boy. I don't know all the details. I don't even know what exactly my father's role was in the USSR, but from what I understand, we were granted asylum in the United States and had to flee Belarus in 1991. But that's not really why I'm writing this story. This is about something I saw in my childhood that has scarred me for life. This took place roughly a year before we left, so I'm guessing the year was 1990. My family, like many others, lived in a massive apartment building in Minsk. There were two other identical apartment buildings adjacent to ours, and directly behind the buildings was a playground area where I would play with my friends Sasha and Victor. Beyond the playground was a section of trees that separated a shopping plaza from the apartment grounds. I remember that my mother was feeling ill and was bedridden, and my father was away on business in Moscow, so I was pretty much on my own that night. I remember that I had gotten bored watching TV in the living room and decided to go outside and see if any of my friends were at the playground. I would say this was around 8 p.m. and it was dark out. By then, most of the children were inside, and I don't even think anyone was allowed on the playground at that time, but I didn't care. There was no one around to tell me to go back inside, and I was pretty excited to have the playground all to myself. It was chilly out that night, but it was not snowing, so I figured that I would play on the slides and swing set until I either got bored or if security came along and told me to go back inside. So there I was, just swinging in the dark, when I heard something near the fence that separated the trees from the playground. There was a strange noise, like someone was sawing wood, but there was something just off about it. I ignored the sound, but it became louder as time passed, to the point where I became curious as to what was causing this strange noise. There were no lights at the playground itself, but there were lights mounted to the back of the apartment buildings that illuminated things just enough to where you could see your surroundings. But the trees beyond the fence were pitch black. I got off the swing set and approached the edge of the playground. The sound continued getting louder, even as I got up right to the fence. It wasn't until I let out a curious "hello?" that the noise ceased. I stood there staring into the dark trees, waiting for a response, but all remained silent. After about another minute passed, I innocently asked, "Why are you chopping down trees in the dark?" I then heard a shuffling from within the trees, and soon I saw a dark figure come into view, but did not step out from the tree line. What happened next is something that still makes me want to vomit out my insides. The dark figure then threw something. The object flew over the fence and hit me directly in the chest. I was knocked backwards, more out of surprise than the actual force of the impact. "Hey, why'd you do that?" I shouted. But before I could get another word out, I caught a glimpse of what had been thrown at me. A severed human arm was lying on the ground in front of me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran back towards the apartments, bawling my eyes out. I stormed into our apartment and sat on the living room couch to collect myself. I did think about waking my sick mother and telling her about what happened, but decided against it. To give you some perspective, my mother grew up in Siberia, and she could be quite ruthless at times. Not only would she not be too happy about being woken up, but she most likely wouldn't believe my story. And I probably wouldn't be able to sit down for a week if she found out I left the apartment alone after dark. So I kept this incident to myself. As a child, I understood that what happened was scary, but I had no grasp of the implications. I thought there was a monster in the woods who ate people who came out after dark. Now that I'm an adult, there are some things that I've come to realize. For our remaining time in Belarus, I never saw or heard any kind of investigation regarding a missing person or a mutilated body being discovered, which is nothing out of the ordinary living in Soviet society. The monster in the woods, hiding in the trees that night, was most likely a sadistic madman, dismembering a human body with a hacksaw. There is one more thing that I should mention. For the rest of the time that we lived there, I cannot for the life of me recall ever seeing my friend Sasha again after that night.
This is a story that my friend actually experienced. My friend had a habit of sleeping with both arms stretching over his head as if he were doing a hurrah. One day he was sleeping in that same position as usual. However, suddenly he couldn't move his body. There was a big window by his bedside, and because it was summer, he was sleeping with the windows wide open. All of a sudden, he could see a woman through the window. Her face looked kind of weird, as if she wasn't a human at all. The woman with a creepy face pulled my friend's arm violently. At that moment, he saw her mouth had almost ripped up to her ears. She gave the most horrifying loud laugh when she pulled his arm, and my friend who was struggling was soon released from his sleep paralysis. When I came to my senses, there was a thick bruise on both of my arms, with handprints, he said. I live in the countryside, and there was a pretty famous reservoir in our area. One evening, one of my father's friends drove me home in a car, and we were just passing through that area. All of a sudden, a woman softly walking into the reservoir caught my eye. I couldn't see her face, but she had black clothing covering it, and she just went into the reservoir in the blink of an eye. My dad's friend next to me also saw the figure, and at that moment, neither of us could say anything. Then he stepped on the gas like a crazy man. After arriving home, he made sure I went inside the house and even said to me to not forget to check the door before I go to bed. Not long after, the broadcasting authorities came to the reservoir with some famous celebrities to shoot some kind of TV program. And seeing those celebrities falling into the reservoir somehow made me sick. I have no idea if the person I had seen that day was a person or a ghost. But after that, there are always 4 people who die there every year. When I was young, there was an accident where one of my older sister's classmates slipped on ice while playing and died of a concussion. Her friend's name was Billy. A few years later, my mom suddenly brought up the story about Billy to my sister while we were staying at home. "Hey, do you guys remember the kid who died of a concussion? Your friend, Billy?" Then I heard someone abruptly knocking on our front door. The apartment where I lived had a hallway with several houses side by side, but the hallway was kind of old, so the sound of people walking around outside seemed very loud. Furthermore, there wasn't a sign of anyone that day, but someone had just knocked on my door. My mom, my sister, and I stood at the back without saying anything to each other, thinking something was wrong. The constant knocking continued, and my mom finally answered. "Who is it?" Then someone from outside said, "Is Billy here? Is Billy here? Is Billy here?" It was a woman, and she asked these 3 same questions in a very dry voice. "No, he's not here." When my mom said it like this, it became quiet outside. And when I looked through the peephole, she was already gone. I couldn't even hear the sound of footsteps. To this day, I still wonder who she was.